deepening rift inside the Atlantic Alliance is now playing out in public and behind closed doors, and its immediate consequence is one that could reshape security calculations across Eastern Europe. In recent days, USS officials told their counterparts in Tallinn that certain deliveries of battlefield systems would be delayed, a move described to some as a suspension of shipments. Systems named by several officials include precision anti-armor weapons and rocket artillery munitions. Together, they are the kinds of tools frontline NATO members rely on to deter and, if necessary, defeat a fast-moving ground threat. For Estonia, a nation that shares a border with Russia and has invested heavily in its national defense since 2014, the news landed like a cold wind. Tallinn's leaders quickly raised alarm, warning that any interruption in scheduled deliveries could erode readiness at a moment of heightened regional tension. From the corridors of the Pentagon to command posts across the Pentagon to command posts across the Baltic, planners are now recalculating how to manage training timelines, force posture, and the immediate needs of units in the field. At the center of the American decision is a simple, brutal fact of logistics. Years of sustained high-intensity operations have pushed USO's munitions and weapon stocks to the edge, forcing Washington to make difficult choices about where limited supplies will go first. Defense officials say the protracted combat operations across multiple theaters have consumed inventories faster than industry can replenish them. That mismatch between demand driven by active operations and the pace of production is the practical driver behind a policy that until now most allies assumed would be automatic and unconditional. U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has been the face of that hard choice, speaking candidly about the strain on American stockpiles and the need to prioritize. Officials described discussions that range from delaying planned shipments to some partners to rerouting material to units currently engaged in active combat operations. For nations on NATO's eastern flank, the calculus is grim. What has been perceived as a rock-solid supply line may now be subject to strategic triage. The wider context matters. The past 3 years have seen simultaneous and intense military activity in multiple regions. The conflict involving Iran and related operations in the Middle East has drawn down weapons, spares, and long-lead munitions. At the same time, the alliance has continued to support Ukraine with equipment and training. Those combined demands, officials say, have outpaced the industrial base's ability to deliver replacements quickly enough. Equally significant has been the political dimension inside Washington. Senior U.S. officials and some of the White House have begun to speak in blunt terms about reciprocity and measured support. The administration has signaled that future assistance could be shaped by how closely all IS-backed Washington in recent military actions. That shift has been crystallized in an internal effort described by several diplomats and officials to categorize NATO members in tiers of support. The shorthand that has emerged in several briefings is a naughty and nice framework, a way of ranking partners according to whether they answered U.S. calls for help during the recent Iran campaign. The existence of such a ranking is now a matter of public debate. According to multiple briefings to European diplomats, the list was prepared ahead of high-level meetings in Washington and includes a tiered breakdown of contributions. Allies who joined or materially supported U.S. operations would be rewarded with deeper cooperation. Those who declined or limited their support could see acquired downgrading of engagement from fewer joint exercises to a smaller forward presence. This is not theory. The messages coming out of senior Washington briefings have been stark. One White House official was quoted as saying, "The United States will remember," a phrase intended to underscore that past behavior will shape future choices. U.S. defense officials have publicly praised a set of countries they consider model partners, nations that allowed basing, contributed forces and material, and expedited logistics, while warning that those who were reticent would face consequences. President Donald Trump, addressing reporters on the subject, voiced frustration with what he called a lack of reciprocal burden sharing. In an extended comment, he said, "We've been very disappointed in NATO. They weren't there for us. We pay trillions of dollars for NATO, and they weren't there for us." When pressed on whether countries would be punished for not helping, he responded, "We'll see what happens." Those words and the tone behind them mark a departure from the idea of an alliance that operates on automatic solidarity. Defense officials have been more categorical about the types of incentives and penalties under consideration. Allies that are viewed as steadfast could receive an increased USS Steadfast, could receive an increased U.S. presence, expanded joint exercises, and prioritized access to foreign military sales. Conversely, those judged insufficiently supportive might see fewer bilateral training opportunities, slower arms deliveries, or a reorientation of U.S. basing and rotational forces to favor regions and partners deemed more reliable. For states in Eastern Europe and the Baltics, which have placed their security bets on a continuous American presence, the prospect of reassessment is unnerving. The diplomatic fallout has been swift. Several European capitals have expressed concern that openly differentiating among NATO members risks damaging the alliance cohesion precisely when unity is most important. Lawmakers in Washington have also raised alarms, warning that any public or punitive fracturing of partnership ties could undercut NATO's deterrence and complicate U.S. military planning. Some analysts point out a difficult truth. Moving forces away from an ally may be intended as a message, but it can also create new gaps in regional security that complicate deterrence for everyone. In practical terms, the pressure on U.S. actuals stocks has sparked conversations at the highest levels between the Pentagon and industry. Defense procurement teams and civilian leaders have been in active talks with major manufacturers, including some civilian automakers, about expanding production lines and accelerating delivery of critical components. The need to scale up production, to rebuild reserves, and to modernize supply chains has been framed as a national security imperative that transcends party lines. At the same time, the debate has provoked questions about the architecture of NATO itself. An alliance built on collective defense since the end of the Second World War assumed a baseline of mutual support. If the United States begins to condition certain forms of cooperation, some far-eaters worry that the legal and political glue that binds the alliance could weaken. Others argue that a more merit-based system could compel hesitant governments to invest more in capabilities and to shoulder greater responsibility for regional security. Across the Baltic states, reaction has been mixed but determined. Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia have long been among Europe's most vocal proponents of robust defense spending and close integration with U.S. special integration with U.S. BOW capabilities. Their defense ministries emphasize that deterrence is not just about weapons transfers, but also about the credibility of long-term commitments. For countries that have hosted rotational U.S. forces and invested in interoperability, being placed in a favorable tier would reaffirm their strategy. Being seen as unreliable would force a costly strategic rethink. Poland and Romania, both of which have hosted significant U.S. presence in recent years, are widely perceived in Washington as reliable partners, and officials say they are likely to remain in the upper echelons of any internal ranking. By contrast, some Western European capitals that publicly advocated restraint during the recent campaign in the Middle East now find themselves the subjects of quiet U.S. and plain in the Middle East scrutiny. Officials in Madrid, London, and Paris have, in different ways, defended their policy choices as prudential or diplomatic. In response, U.S. policymakers say they are seeking to differentiate between legitimate strategic caution and a refusal to contribute when it matters most. This episode also highlights the limits of military logistics in a globalized world. The U.S. industrial base is vast, but high-quality munitions, smart weapons, and specialized platforms are not things that can be conjured overnight. Replenishing stockpiles requires months, sometimes years, of production and testing. That lag means that the choices Washington makes now about which partners receive what and when will have effects that last well beyond. The current crises for NATO militaries planning for contingency operations, the uncertainty is destabilizing. Training schedules that assumed a steady trickle of U.S.-provided systems must be revised. Exercises designed to test interoperability may need to be scaled back or refocused. And perhaps most importantly, political leaders must answer a hard strategic question: can Europe build the industrial capacity and political will to fill any voids left by a United States that is increasingly selective? Not everyone in Washington agrees on the wisdom of a punitive posture. Some lawmakers and military leaders warn that public threats or even quiet downgrades could erode trust. They caution that alliance management, particularly during active conflicts, demands careful diplomacy and a long-term view that preserves the mythic mutual defense compact at NATO's core. Others counter that fairness and accountability are essential. Allies that benefit from U.S. security guarantees should not be free riders. Amid the political jockeying, the human dimension remains stark. Small militaries in the Baltics and Northern Europe are balancing conscription policies, forced modernization, and reserve mobilization with the urgent need to maintain stocks of helmets, ammunition, and anti-armor weaponry. Military commanders are pragmatic by necessity. Stock shortages require them to prioritize training for likely scenarios and to seek alternate suppliers where possible. In many capitals, defense ministries are accelerating domestic procurement and exploring deeper cooperation with European manufacturers to hedge against future interruptions. There's also a reputational risk to consider. For the United States, the message sent by any suspension or slowdown in deliveries is double-edged. It may be intended to encourage burden sharing and to reward allies that align with U.S. objectives, but it also risks convincing some partners that U.S. support is conditional and transactional, and that in a crisis, American priorities may not match theirs. That perception could drive a recalibration in European defense policy, more investment in indigenous capabilities, new defense partnerships within Europe, and a rethinking of reliance on transatlantic supply chains. For the alliance as a whole, the moment is a test of resilience. NATO's strength has always derived from the belief that collective defense cannot be reduced to a ledger of exchanges. The idea that some members are in and others out undercuts that ethic. Yet in practice, alliances are political instruments as much as military ones. They reflect national interests, domestic politics, and diplomatic bargaining. How Washington chooses to use leverage in service of its strategic aims will shape NATO's internal dynamics for years to come. There are potential pathways forward that could mitigate the damage. One option is a more transparent mechanism for burden sharing that ties assistance to clear jointly a nation, agreed criteria rather than ad hoc lists. Another is a concerted effort to accelerate European defense industrial cooperation so that partners can become more self-sufficient in key classes of weapons. A third is renewed diplomatic outreach, not merely to cajole, but to negotiate binding commitments that reassure both capitals and troops on the ground. Whatever route is chosen, the stakes are high. Deterrence in Europe rests not only on weapons and troops, but on the belief among member states that allies will stand together when tested. The recent moves in Washington and the reports of internal lists and reprioritized shipments risk introducing doubt into that calculus. As diplomats and defense planners scramble to manage the immediate implications, one thing is clear: the post-war assumptions that underpin NATO for decades are under scrutiny. The alliance that emerged from successive crises in the 20th century is being asked to adapt to a 21st century where conflicts are simultaneous, supply chains are stretched, and political expectations are changing. How it navigates this moment, whether by reinforcing a shared sense of duty or by allowing transaction divisions to grow, will define not just the next few months, but the character of the alliance for a generation. In the short term, the focus will be on practical problem solving, finding alternate suppliers, shifting forces to where they can have the most deterrent effect, and patching readiness gaps before they become crises. In the longer term, the choice will be political and strategic, whether NATO reaffirms a model of collective defense that treats solidarity as a sacred principle, or whether it becomes a more fluid coalition of differently committed partners, each judged on a sliding scale of support. As the debate unfolds, leaders on both sides of the Atlantic are acutely aware that credibility is fragile. A world that appears more chaotic and more dangerous demands collect. I have responses. The question now is whether the alliance, tested, strained, and once again called upon to act in unity, can adapt without fracturing. The answer will be written in policy memos and at summit tables, in factories and shipyards, and in the quiet consultations between defense ministers who must reconcile national politics with the reality of shared risks. For now, allies watch and wait, trying to read Washington's priorities, hoping for assurances and preparing contingency plans of their own. The choices made in the next weeks and months will echo far beyond any single weapon shipment. They will help determine whether NATO remains a fortress of shared defense or becomes a patchwork of conditional commitments, and whether in an increasingly dangerous world, the promise of collective security can still be trusted.